I found rather disturbing papers among these historical documents. Have you ever heard of the Collier brothers? Theirs is one of the more interesting tales in American history, if not a bit morbid. As a brief introduction, they were a pair of brothers who lived in New York City. During their lives there in Harlem, they became infamous for their hoarding. It wasn't known until their rather macabre deaths the extent of their compulsion. To this day, the impact the Collier brothers left on the city is still somewhat well known. I'm an amateur historian. Although I don't technically have an area of expertise, I pride myself on the era of the late 19th to early 20th century. Furthermore, I've always been more interested in microhistory. This means that I enjoy learning about the lives of less impactful people and events. Being from Harlem originally, the Collier brothers have long been a fascination of mine. Naturally, when some of the artifacts auctioned away from the Collier estate were put up for sale, I jumped at the opportunity. Finally, I had the chance to get in the weeds with some serious, first-hand artifacts of one of my guiltiest pleasures. The collection I bought consisted mostly of documents found in the household. Not the flashiest things taken from the estate, but any historian knows that documents, especially primary sources like these, are invaluable. It was while looking through these bills of sale, family letters, and other such documents that I found something that stood apart. The rest of this post will be my transcription of the papers I have found. Afterward, I'll share my thoughts, especially those that unnerve me. A wintry gust rolled through the house. The frail, old man shivered as the frigid tendrils of wind slipped in through his collar and ran down his spine. His folded arms tightened. His ghostly breath hung in the air. The fire had died in his sleep. As he sat in his armchair, Homer turned his attention to Langley's weathered, dark green one. The once brilliant reds of the fabric roses were now muted to filthy brown blotches. "Where are you, Langley?" Homer muttered to himself. Another wicked chill pierced through Homer's shirt. His coat, at this point little more than a faded cowhide, hung on the coat rack, just out of arm's reach. He extended his hand. His long, unkempt, and yellowing nails just scratched at the sleeves of the leather coat, but in extending his arm, his ill-fitted shirt pulled back. The wind stung at the open skin of his wrist. "Damn thing!" Homer snapped, pulling his arm back in and rubbing sensation back into his wrist. The wind rattled the windows of the decrepit mansion. Undoubtedly, Langley had moved the coat rack. Perhaps he'd nudged it aside on his way out to the market square. When Homer had fallen into his midday nap, the rack was directly next to his chair. And his walking stick. Where was his walking stick? Homer hunched his head as far over the edge of the chair as he could manage. His legs were old, and they were beginning to give in to the condition. Walking was manageable only with the aid of his walnut cane. Standing up on his own was out of the question. But the walking stick was on the floor right next to his chair. It had only fallen over, likely from the gusts. Homer decided that the cane was an easier accomplishment than the coat. Once he had the stick, he could pull the coat rack closer. The first thought was to nudge the stick closer with his foot, but the few muscles left in his appendage refused to obey him. Homer slammed his fist on the arm of his chair. His leg had been stiff and numb for months, but now it felt like a wooden club attached to his body. He massaged his left knee, trying to work any sensation out of the flesh. After several minutes, and another wicked chill, he gave up. The leg had no feeling whatsoever. Although the thought of hypothermia being the cause crossed his mind, he knew certainly the true cause was the worsening of his disease. Homer let his head fall back against the chair. He faced the broken ceiling, but his eyes darted to the coat rack. He let his gaze trail the seams of the fabric until it reached the table below. His meal from the night before still sat there. On top of the plate were scraps of meat and crusted potatoes. His steak knife rested among the clutter next to the plate. His mind began to wander. He grabbed the knife with a trembling hand. His knuckles hit a cup which fell and shattered on the floor, decorating the piles of clutter and dust with shards of glass. Homer tightened his grip on the knife and brought it to him. How numb was his leg? Homer hesitated, telling himself no good could come from the experiment. But curiosity got the better of him. With one hand he pulled up his pant leg, and with the other he pierced his calf. Not deep, but only enough to be sure. It was as he feared. Homer set the knife back down. As a bead of wine-dark blood formed from the wound, yet another gust struck him, and now his frustration was at a peak. He grumbled as he forced himself to his feet. He pushed his arms to their limits, trembling, shaking at his body weight, but somehow he managed to get up. Now he smirked and let out a slight chuckle. He was not too far gone just yet. But his mistake was in reaching for his cane rather than his coat. He leaned over to grab it, but felt a tug in his gut when he realized that he had gone too far, leaned too far. His muscles could not cope. His arm was not close enough to the ground to reach the cane, and yet he had gone too low to pull himself back up with his strength. He crumbled. And now he raged. He cursed and shouted as much as his waning lungs would allow. The wooden planks below him were cold. The air around him was cold. His muscles were exhausted and unfit. He gave up the fight. He simply lay there, staring at the piles of clutter filling the rest of the sitting room. Mountains of rare collector's items mixed with old car parts. Expensive artworks, vases, and sculptures. And garbage, refuse, and rubble. For a moment he wondered how it had gotten to this point, but he did not dwell on the thought. He could not dwell on the thought. For as disgusting the condition of his house was, he could not do a thing to change it. He was too weak and too poor now. And even if he could change it, he knew that he would not. His greed had always been this way. Even before his body was sick, his mind was sick. He was plagued to live in a junkyard of his own making. One that he despised, yet craved more so. The only thing in this world he cared for more than possessions was his brother Langley. Langley, who cared for Homer, and who had been the only one to never abandon him, despite his lifestyle. His greed. His gluttony, sloth, envy. Truly his collection of sins was as broad and indiscriminate as the rest of his hoard. "Please hurry home, Langley," Homer muttered. Then he accepted his situation and rested his cheek on the floor. "Good God, Homer." The old man opened his eyes. His sight was blurry from his nap, but he saw the familiar skinny shape of his younger brother, Langley, rushing to his aid. He grabbed Homer and helped him to his feet. "Are you all right?" he asked. Homer could not make out his facial expression yet. His vision was still foggy. But the bushy mustache under a long pointed nose. The bald crown of his head matched with wild, wavy locks of hair underneath. That silhouette was the calling card of his brother. "I'm fine. I'm fine," Homer insisted as he slumped back into his chair. "I fell over trying to get my coat." Another gust swept through the house. "Grab it for me, will you? The chills are dreadful." Now Homer's vision had cleared up completely. He could make out his surroundings. Langley gave him his coat and tried to help him put it on, to which Homer chastised him. "I'm not a child, you know." "No," Langley said, walking to his chair opposite the fireplace. "A child could pick themselves up, yes? Homer let out a guttural chuckle. How do you know I didn't simply prefer the ground? Langley shared a bemused snort at this. Even now with his coat on, the frigidness of the room lingered on him. Put a fire on, won't you, Langley? The younger brother got up from his chair without complaint. I could offer a hand, Homer said. It's no trouble, Homer, Langley insisted. Besides, I don't want you falling in. Homer chuckled again. Homer, Langley continued, not looking away from the tinder. How is your leg? Is it feeling better? When Homer did not answer, Langley turned and looked over his shoulder at him. It's worse, isn't it? Much worse. Homer rubbed his leg again, hoping to feel something, but nothing came. He remembered his experiment from earlier. As soon as Langley had placed the logs in their right spot and the fire began to grow, Homer spoke up. I found something rather peculiar today. Langley stopped just in front of his tan lounge chair. It wasn't it, was it? No. Of course not. I haven't seen that thing in some time, Homer assured him. Langley faced Homer completely, taking a step forward. Then what? Homer hesitated for a moment. Then, with some effort, leaned over and rolled up his pant leg to reveal the incision on his calf. Langley squinted at first, perhaps not understanding what he was witnessing. And why would he? Normally a cut would be red and bloody. But this cut was black as coal. The muscle underneath is decayed and ashy. The skin surrounding the cut was sickly white and hard as stone. The bead of wine-dark blood from earlier, it seemed, was the last of its kind in the old man's leg. This is no disease, Langley. This can only have been caused by, well, that thing. Langley met Homer's eyes. The concern and confusion upon it were only rivaled by the fear. He worked to regain his composure, brushed off his trousers and said, What can we do? There is no longer any we, Langley. Whatever the monster is, it has anchored itself to my flesh. Langley kept eye contact, challenging Homer to state his intentions aloud. Homer obliged and said it plainly. You must leave. No, Langley said plainly. Firmly. I will not leave you here to rot away. To fade alone in your filth, Homer. You'd rather rot away in my filth with me? Homer inquired. He waved the thought away with his hand. This is not a suggestion, Langley. I am ordering you to leave. I do not want you in my house any longer. You have shown me far too much patience and kindness for me to allow it. Homer, your condition worsens by the day. If I left tomorrow, and you awoke unable to move your legs, you would starve. Langley paced, his arms moving emphatically. You already cannot raise yourself from a minor collapse. Damn it, Langley. This conversation is finished. I will not have you in this home a day longer. The brief fit of rage left Homer breathless. He took a moment to gather his energy. He coughed through a scratchy, dry throat. I will not sit back and let the only family to ever care for me die alongside me. Homer looked to the fire roaring behind Langley, but dared not meet his gaze directly. That is final. Langley shook his head and sat down. He put his chin in his palm and looked past the clutter and out the window. As dusk light fell upon his face, Langley said, Do you think I would be any safer on the road? Given there are no monsters on the road, yes, Langley, I dare say you'll fare better than I. Langley did not look away from the window. The shadows from the fire flickered across his face. I saw it today, Homer. The monster. Homer straightened himself. With a quivering lip inquired, "Where? In the kitchen again? It hasn't made it past the first floor, has it?" Langley shook his head. "You misunderstand me, Homer. I did not see it here." Langley took a moment to continue. Before he did, he turned back and faced Homer at an angle. Now, as his face was lit by the flames directly, Langley appeared much older and much more haunted. The salt and pepper waves of his unkempt hair hung down, obscuring his eyes from Homer's view. "I saw it in town. Just out of sight, like always. Just near the edge of a wall. Just out of sight so that I questioned my senses. It was in an alleyway across the street from me. And it was staring straight at me." Homer's breathing increased in speed as he took in this information. The misty condensation passed his eyes. His heart beat and his lip trembled as he pleaded to himself, "That's impossible. No, no, this can't be." "It is, Homer," Langley said with no emotion. "I've thought of it all day. You see, that thing isn't just tied to you anymore. Even if I did leave, it would follow. Perhaps it would take you first, then find me. Perhaps it would follow me and leave you to starve. All that I'm certain of, Homer, is that I cannot leave you. Now more than ever, we're in this together." Homer swallowed hard. His voice nearly cracked as he muttered, "Together then. And when we die, let us hope it will be quick. And let us hope the afterlife is kinder to us than this one ever was." Have you noticed what unnerved me so much about these documents? Yes, the conversation between the two is rather preternatural, but it's quite common to get authors embellishing the story of the Colliers given the nature of it. It is precisely the fact that this reads like the telling of a story. This isn't an account from either of the brothers. It's written in the third person, and as far as I'm aware, no other person lived in the house. I called the previous owner to inquire about the possibility that some drafts of a fictional story made it into the collection, but the owner denied it. Some parts of the collection were never touched, even immediately following the emptying of the house. These were only some of the pages, I'm sure, but they were the only ones of this kind within the letterbox. I have mixed feelings about all this. On the one hand, if what's written is true, it disturbs me quite a lot. On the other hand, the thought of me being the first person to read through these documents is exhilarating. I still have many more boxes full of documents to sift through. If I find more like these, I'll post an update. I found rather disturbing papers among these historical documents. Part 2. It's been a long couple of nights. I've stayed up through most of them, sifting through the many cardboard boxes, searching for more of those strange papers. You see, I'm not having to check through just a few boxes. If you haven't seen the images of the Colliers collection, you should take a moment to look them up. The extent of the hoard is just as the papers describe them, mountains. I'm currently sitting here in my dining room, typing this out on my laptop, while surrounded by stacks and stacks of boxes and bound newspapers. I almost feel like the Collier brothers myself, in more ways than one. But in my digging, I've found several more entries. Each of the mysterious stories I've found have been near the top of their respective boxes, never deeper beneath. Interestingly enough, all of the entries are also wrapped the same way. They're trifolded, like the papers you'd pull out of an envelope, and also bound with hemp string. Now, not every bundle of papers that matches this description that I've found has been entries in the story, but I haven't found an entry to the story presented any other way. Furthermore, I think I've worked out a pattern. My theory is that whoever placed these papers in these boxes did so in the same general area. Not only that, but I may know how to tell which boxes were near another. I had the epiphany when, as I was shuffling through the endless documents, I noticed that the box in front of me had a distinctive, blotchy stain that perfectly aligned with the one next to it. If I continue to work through the boxes by lining up the stains and abrasions to find their neighbors, then maybe I can more easily find the rest of the entries. I'm getting ahead of myself. I apologize for the rambling, but this is fascinating to me. Until I get the chance to find more, I'll transcribe what I've found. This, I think, is the correct chronological order of the writings. After I post this, I think I'll take a well-deserved rest. This task is starting to take its toll on me. Ragged, dilapidated, hermetic, contemptible. He lay there on his mattress, unconscious and weak. Homer Collier, the sad old shut-in, breathed his raspy breaths. He slipped aside a mound of papers. They held news. News of a world the desolate recluse did not participate in. News that his faded, milky eyes couldn't read. A practical man would toss the papers out and be done with it. A reasonable man would. But not he. Slowly his eyes opened. For a time, he did not stir. Though consciousness had cursed him again, he kept still, pondering, questioning his life. His vision had decayed. No longer could he make out details. No matter how hard he focused, only blurry silhouettes filled his world. He closed his eyes again. Only in his dreams could he see clearly. He begged for another slumber, another set of visions to escape. But it was for naught. The sloth had slept most of the day through already. His mind refused to slip away again. He forced himself up only slightly. He shifted to his back. He stuffed the pillows beneath him so that he could face the door. And there he saw it. Almost breathlessly, he muttered the name Langley. Asked if his brother was there. Was that his silhouette? When no answer came, he swallowed hard. "Do you dare?" he asked, feigning fortitude. "Do you truly face me plainly in my room? Apparition?" But the spirit said nothing. "Are you a ghost? Or a monster? Perhaps an intruder come for my fortune?" Slowly the old man moved his hand to the nightstand. Slowly towards the drawer. Towards the pistol inside. Asterisk pop. Asterisk he was pale as a ghost on his arrival. The blood was gone from his face. A look of utter and unmistakable dread. Langley slowly pacified. His brother was still living. The breaths began to fill Langley's lungs again. What in God's name, Homer? Homer looked at the shape of his kin, now standing where it had just stood. Surely you didn't think. I dared not imagine it. I only ran when I heard the shot. They kept silent, only looking at each other. Why then? Langley wondered. If not for that purpose, then for what? It was here, dear brother. Or rather there. Standing where you are now. In the threshold of my room. Again Langley's face grew pale. It couldn't be. It wasn't so. That it could go where it once would not. That it would ascend to the second floor. Why only now? Langley wondered aloud. After all these years. Why is it only now stepping closer? End of entry. The strange man stumbled his way through the labyrinth of litter. Although he was an intruder to this home, although he had climbed through the second-floor window, now that he was in, he felt the greatest dismay of his life. The floor crunched underneath him. The years, nay, decades of refuse caused his every move to be announced. "Who dares go there?" called a voice from the other side of the piles. "Is it you, Langley? Or is it you, apparition?" The man slowly stepped towards the voice. On the other side of a grand piano, piled high with newspapers and dishes, sat an old hermit. He was in front of a fire, whose amber flames flickered on the wrinkles of the aged face. "He's neither," said a voice from directly behind the guest. In shock, he recoiled and pulled his baton. "Easy, officer. Would you dare strike a man in his own home?" asked Langley. "Apologies, Mr. Collier," muttered the shaken policeman. "Only here on duty. Came inquiring on the payment of some utility bills." Langley clicked his tongue in disapproval. This is what the officers of this city do now? Come beckoning, breaking, and entering on behest of the banks. "They're quite overdue," responded the officer. He pulled a booklet from his pocket and offered it to the shaggy-headed man. He took it, but not kindly. "I must find my checkbook," Langley said. "Homer, watch over our guest, won't you?" As the younger brother walked out of the room, the elder chuckled to himself. "Watch after." The officer now took a more inquisitive look at the geezer sitting in his tattered chair. His gaze did not move from the flames. His body was arched, awkwardly and crookedly. "Why do you sit like that?" asked the policeman. "With your knees to your chin. And why do you stare into the flames?" "My vision is gone. My body is locked. I could not move from this position if I willed it with every bit of strength I had left. I am entombed in this sarcophagus of a corpse, only still surviving. Barely." Langley returned. He placed a freshly written check in the officer's palm. The policeman leaned in to whisper to the younger brother. "Perhaps it is time. It would be cruel to let him continue as he is." Langley stared odiously at the man. "How did you get in?" he asked. "A ladder through the second-story window. Everything on the first is barred. Did it occur to you that it was for a reason? Leave. Quickly." After he was sure the officer was gone, Langley got to work. He constructed barricades at every window, just as he had done on the first floor. When he was sure no entry could be permitted, he returned to his brother's side, to his moldy green armchair. As the warmth of the hearth kissed his cheeks, he considered the policeman's words. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps for both of them. End of entry. At last, he had completed them. The last of the fixtures. The still mobile Collier admired his work. A simple snare. One that he would know to avoid, but one that an intruder would miss amongst the clutter. The last of a series of trappings to keep himself and his brother safe. To give them some respite from the monster and any intruders as well. But not just that. Also to keep the outsiders safe. So that none of them would intrude and set the apparition free. The radio's tune swung gently through the air. Langley allowed himself to collapse into his armchair. "My back is quite stiff, Homer. Setting those traps is a job ill-suited to an old geezer such as I. Yet you are immeasurably more suited compared to me." They shared a chuckle. "You do not understand gratitude, dear brother. You do not understand dear gratitude until you have lost your sight, your body, your sound mind. You do not know how grateful I am to keep my voice and ears. nor how displeased I am that those were the last to go," chided Langley. Once again they laughed merrily. They had gone several days without disturbance from their monster. Several days of seeming normalcy. It would be their last. End of entry. Those were the only 3 that I have found, but what a find they have been. The story, the true story of what happened to the brothers, may nearly be mine to know. And perhaps, even likely, I will be the first to know the truth. Anyhow, I must get some rest. The exhaustion is playing tricks on my mind. I keep seeing shapes just at the edge of my vision. Maybe I'm being paranoid from the readings, but it almost seems familiar. No, I'm being silly. I'll update you again soon. If that last paragraph is anything to go by, perhaps I only have one more installment to find. I found rather disturbing papers among these historical documents. Final. I discovered the last entry. I first read it the other night after I said I would go to sleep. But as I moved aside one of the boxes to get to my room, I felt its distinct lack of weight and a soft shifting of the contents inside. There was only this final note. It was bound in twine like the others, but it was bound alongside something else. I don't want to give too much away, so I'll just get into it. It was another wickedly wintry day. The last cold snap before the warmth of spring could blossom. Homer spoke with his brother in between bites of his dinner. His arms no longer moved, only his face and neck. As Langley fed him, they conversed and listened to a gentle tune on the radio. Peaceful, content with their situation. Then a breeze crept in through the ragged window. Langley Collier searched the room for a blanket or shell. Eventually, he settled on an old worn suit jacket that he draped over top his brother's arched body. But the suit jacket was not just any incidental coat. No random rag. It was mine. From an age long ago. From an age now past. The jacket I'd worn so often in life now was used to shield the old hermit from the frigid gusts. But the jacket was not what I desired. It was not what kept me bound to this disgraceful domicile. It was the treasure inside. The elder brother looked past the younger, into the conglomerations of possessions long kept. There he saw me. Not with his eyes, for they saw nothing save for blackness, but with his soul. He knew. Langley, he whispered. I feel its presence near. In this very room. Langley paused from his task of feeding the old man. He allowed his senses to think for him. Is it very close? Will it set off the traps? He whispered back. Does the creature interact with our physical world? Do we even know? How should I act? As if nothing were the matter? They discussed it for a while. All the time I waited patiently. So patiently. Slowly my emotions harshened as I recalled how many long years I had let them be. I had forgiven them for their sin. But now I could bear it no longer. I had absolved them before by letting them claim ignorance. They did not know what a precious thing they held. But now, as the second brother wore my coat, I knew my dear treasure would soon be found. And once they knew, if they dared discard it again to be treated like rubbish, like just another of their possessions, they would truly feel my wrath. Langley leaned in closer to Homer. In doing so, he pushed the trinket into his brother's rib, and Homer winced. "Langley," he said, "there's something in the pocket." He fished it out and lifted it to the light for a better view. "It's only the locket." Langley Collier now openly looked at me, at the shape of a man now passed on, but not quite. Then back down at the trinket. A beautifully ornate bronze shell. Then inside with the ticking, moving watch hands. He saw the source of my affection and devotion. Her Majesty and Grace. Crafted by God, so delicate in detail and radiant to see. Now I knew the old man understood. Now he knew why I lingered and spied on them. "This is the source of the trouble?" "Only this?" he asked me. "Only this?" I thought. My anger returned, only much more vicious. How foolish could this pair be? I had given them far too many chances. If they did not, into the fire, my dear treasure flew. Into the flames of the filthy hearth. But not for long. In my asperity and indignation, I flew into a frenzy. A torrent of violent, frosty thralls swept through the room. They blew out the fire. They blew away papers and refused. They blew away my coat from the shoulders of the paralyzed miser. "What is happening?" he cried. I tried to destroy it, to banish the demon away. But I was no demon. I was the ghost of a life long gone. And Langley's aberration had only served to cement my place in this world. I could not pass on without the assurance that what I held dearest in life would be taken care of after death, that her radiance would live on. I died in that jacket. At first, I followed the locket, hidden in the pocket of my coat. I witnessed it as it was auctioned away with my estate. Little more than a breeze at the time, I was unseen and could not alter reality. I could only see, only pray. But when that wicked old hoarder had purchased me, back when his legs still moved, I followed him home and watched as he cast my jacket aside. Immediately, without a second thought, onto a pile near the door. For years I lay dormant, awaiting the moment they recognized their misdeed. And as my patience dissolved, I grew more attached to this reality, more determined to shape it. No longer a specter unseen, I was now a shadow, a flicker in the corner of an eye. They began to notice me. They began to whisper about my existence. Slowly, I became more and closer to matter. And I became less and less able to neglect. But they did neglect me. I was bound to the locket and bound to the first floor. They moved upstairs and refused to see me. Until the day came. The fateful, frosty day. Langley was on his way to the market, as he did only once a month. But as he opened the grand door, and the gales pierced his shirt, he realized he was ill-dressed for the cold. He grabbed the first thing he saw, my coat. So I followed him. Only he saw me. Only he knew to look. I trailed him through the city and the crowds. My first look outside the den of degeneracy in years. Then he returned home and found his crippled brother asleep on the floor. As he went to make the fire that night, he took off my coat and set it aside. So close, but again I despaired that perhaps they would never notice it. I grew impatient. Days later I watched as Homer slept. I was more than I was before. No longer just a shadow in the distance, or a motion in the periphery. And though his vision was faded, he looked at me directly. He fired his gun right through me, where my head would have been. But I was still not a part of this reality, not fully at least. It was Langley's abrasive action. His despicable attempt to rid himself of me without care finally shaped me into what I am now. As the torrent of winds died down, the old man whose eyes still worked took his arm away from his face to see me and finally behold me. I was now in the shape of a man, the man I was in life. Only the faint shadows of my outline could give away my true identity. Langley stammered and stepped backward. He did not pay any attention to his surroundings. If he had, perhaps he would not have tripped his trap. An avalanche of heavy trash fell onto him. It pinned him tightly to the ground. He did not die, but he could not move. His brother cried out to him. He asked what had happened. I moved towards the old man in the chair, and for the first time truly touched him. I pulled my coat from his shoulders. That was when I realized that I could now mold my surroundings. Quickly, I recovered my treasure from the hearth. It showed no signs of damage. It was not in the flames long enough before they were extinguished. For a while, I stood there admiring it. And simultaneously, I wondered what to do next. I knew this form would not last forever. It was only a symptom of my devotion and anger. So I got to work. As Langley choked for air and pleaded for assistance, I searched the stacks for blank paper. I sat at a desktop and shoved the litter atop it onto the floor. I have written these pages for the next owner to find, so that they know not only what I desire, but what will befall them if they fail to heed my instruction. I have written these pages to detail every extent of misery I have felt and witnessed. I begin with this final page. I will add more, as many more as I can manage in my time in this form. I will paint every excruciating moment that I had to endure but could never speak of. For you see, now is my opportunity. I can now plainly admit to the wickedest of my actions. With what little influence I had in this world, I worsened the decay of the old cripple's condition. I turned his muscles black and tough as brimstone. And now I sit and watch, jubilant, as the two sob and plead. Langley will go first. If he is fortunate, he will asphyxiate and die prone underneath the pile. Homer will not be so lucky. With no one to care for him, and no ability to do so alone, he will starve or freeze. He will die there in front of his fireplace, and only feet from his brother. They will have time to talk, maybe hours, maybe days. They can say their goodbyes and make amends for their past. But they can do nothing to change their fate. One is entombed in the physical embodiment of a lifetime of greed, and the other is trapped in his corpse, incapable of moving or seeing. They will die alone, surrounded by their collection, and they will understand what it cost them. Now I speak directly to you, reader. I do not know when you will find these papers. I pray only that they will not be thrown out when the home is searched. But assuming you read these final words, assuming you have taken in my full testimony, just know, I will have been watching you do so the whole time. And if you choose to follow the same path as the Collier brothers, I will not be as kind. That was the end. I turned my attention from the page to the trinket bound to it in the box, an old, antique locket. I looked up from my work and saw the apparition. Not in my periphery, but straight on, as Homer did in his bed. I nodded to him, and he nodded back. Then I opened the locket to see the watch, but I found something else as well. She was as he described the source of his affection and devotion. Her majesty and grace. Crafted by God, so delicate in detail and radiant to see. He did not mean the watch or the locket, but the picture inside, and the woman within it. The image was old and monotone. It was a wedding photo of a handsome groom and his beautiful bride. The man smiled brightly as his new wife kissed him on the cheek. A moment captured in time. The greatest moment of a life, held dear even after the life was gone. I understood. Without breaking my gaze on the photo, I said, I will look after this. I will take good care of it. Tomorrow, I will take it to a friend who does restoration. He will be delicate. But when I looked up, I saw no apparition. I only felt a soft breeze pass me. A gentle warm breeze which shifted the hair at my shoulders and left through my open window. I did not lie to him. I will uphold my promise. I will wear this locket every day of my life. I will do so with honor, whether he sees it or not. I do not fear the ghost of the groom. I know what he wanted. I know how to act. What I fear is the two shadows I see now in the corner of my eye. One standing, one sitting, because I do not know what they want. A disturbing delivery. This happened when I was a junior in high school saving up for community college. I was heading out for my last delivery for the day in my 2003 Ford Taurus. The Pizza Mobile, as I like to call it. I GPSed the address into my phone. Since I live upstate in the country, most deliveries were driven out in the middle of nowhere. It was around 7 p.m. and the sun was beginning to set. After 20 minutes of windy back roads littered with trees, my GPS said I arrived at the address. It was a tiny cabin house sitting all by itself, surrounded by forest. The lawn looked like it hadn't been mowed in years. Wild vines and weeds wrapped themselves around the tiny wooden cabin. It almost looked vacant, but this didn't faze me. I was used to delivering to places just like this all too often. I walked up to the door and knocked. There was no doorbell. I stood in silence for a bit before I knocked again. Silence. "It's the pizza you order," I yelled out. I heard a low hushed voice from behind the door say, "Bring it out back." I didn't like the vibe I was getting. "Are you sure?" "I have it right here. I can just give it to you now." There was no answer. I almost decided to just turn around and go back to my car with the pizza, but my boss has been on my ass lately about bringing pizza back. So I sighed and started making my way to the back. I remember there being a shed and an empty pool back there. In the empty pool, there was a large circle of rocks. Not just random either, like they were strategically placed there. And in the center, there was a large mass of something. In the dying sun, I couldn't tell exactly what the mass was, but it almost looked like. That's when I heard from behind me, "PSSST, hey you, over here." I turned around to see an old lady poking her head from behind the house. Her hair was crazy. She had electric blue eyes that looked unhinged, and she looked at me with a crazed smile. "I need to show you something." She then pointed to the center of the pool. I dropped the pizza and sprinted back to my car. I got in my car, started it, and floored it. Once I was a good distance away, I pulled over to the side of the road and called the police. A day later, I was informed that the house had been vacant for over 10 years. No one was living in it. I quit my delivery job a few days after that. I could get any other job to help pay for college that didn't involve crazy, unhinged people. I still often wonder what would have happened had I gone up to that woman. And to this day, I'm just glad I didn't see who or what was in the middle of the pool. I was the victim of a disturbing act of revenge. It had been plotted out meticulously and deviously, and in the way only a deeply pained and morally destroyed individual could. It started when I woke up one morning to find a chain padlocked tightly around my ankle. The key slit on the padlock was jammed with some kind of quick-dry cement. I had my dress pants and a shirt on from the previous night, but no socks or shoes. I was lying on a bare mattress in a wood-paneled room. The chain on my ankle trailed across the floor and out of a doorless entryway into a kitchen. I followed the chain through the bare kitchen and into a living room which had a sheet of paper hanging on the wall. Below the paper was an old fishing tackle and an ancient fishing rod. The paper had simple handwriting scrawled across it. If you can survive 3 months on whatever fish you catch, I'll give you a lock cutter and let you go free. The chain continued through the living room and out the front door. From there, I stood on the edge of the wooden deck of an old cabin. I was looking out at a beautiful backyard that backed onto a completely unpopulated lake. At the edge of the water, there was a wooden deck that led out 20 feet. The chain around my ankle led off to the right, where there was a fire pit and a large tree. The chain looped around the tree and was padlocked with the key slit jammed. I walked in every direction, as far as the chain would allow, and made note of the distance from the tree. I had enough chain slack to get into the bedroom of the cabin, to get to the edge of the dock, and then 70 feet to the left or right of the cabin in a 140-foot diameter tether. I yelled. I screamed. But the lake and the woods swallowed up my voice. I knew I was placed here because I'd never be found. Everything was planned out too well. I had no idea where I was. There was no way to call or communicate with anyone. And I was completely alone. That night, I managed to collect enough kindling and wood to start a fire in the pit. I went to sleep hungry, knowing the next day wasn't going to have me waking from this nightmare. I'd be right back there in the morning. And I was. On my second morning there, I drew upon the basic survival methods I knew to stay alive and implemented them around the cabin. By the end of the first week, I managed to create and maintain fires. Then I built small traps to catch squirrels and chipmunks. The traps caught several squirrels on the first night. I roasted them and ate the meat I could. I saved small bits and used them for fish bait on the rusty hooks from the tackle box. The first day of fishing went surprisingly well. I got some bites and managed to catch 2 pickerel and 1 lake trout. Using some old fishing line, I tied together several sticks and built a sort of grill that sat just high enough above the fire to smoke them. I felt like I was becoming one with the land. I actually kind of felt alive. Like I was accomplishing real-life feats that would mean more at the end of my life than everything that preceded. College. Law school. All the pro bono. Then the switch to prosecution. Putting away horrible people. At least most of them were. But the only thing that mattered here was survival. It was me and nature. So I kept the traps going and kept fishing, and over the next few weeks, I found there were more and more bites. I began to catch 5, 6, and sometimes 7 fish a day. And they were getting larger and larger. I spent the nights trying to remember what happened before I woke up at the cabin. I remember working late and clearing out my office on the last day before my early retirement. I went to my car in the parking garage, got in, and then, black. I'm guessing that was when it happened, where I was knocked out in some way. My memory is blurred by impact or chemicals, because I woke up here, and I knew who did it. His name was Patrick Wilkins, and unfortunately, I'd only made his acquaintance when my car had T-boned his. I was driving home alone from a dinner with a coworker. I'd been drinking enough that I'll admit I shouldn't have been driving. But I was. Patrick was in his 20s and had a wife in the front seat. As it turned out, she'd just discovered she was pregnant. Patrick's wife died in the accident, but he survived. I was nearing retirement, and after all the years of courtroom drama, I was looking forward to quiet. Perhaps at a cottage. Which was painfully ironic. My wife passed away when our daughter, and was just going off to college. Now, and works in a shop in the city. I'd always hoped she'd have a big family one day that would come visit me wherever I decided to play out my retirement. After the accident, I knew how to talk to the right people to tilt the investigation in my favor. The crash had occurred on a country road intersection. Only some prankster had removed the stop signs. Technically, it wasn't my fault. But still, I'd been drinking and was driving way too fast. I called in every favor I had and managed to get rid of the toxicology, fudged the information for the tire mark skid lengths on the road, and the impact details, and eventually had the case thrown out. I'd already planned my retirement, so it was a quiet exit. I'd hired a private investigator to look into Patrick, who disappeared after the case died. But before I got the file on Patrick, I was finishing my last day of work. Then I was walking to my car. Then I was getting into it. Then, black. I understood why Patrick would want revenge. I just didn't understand this. Why the cabin and the fishing and the 3 months? Wondering about it didn't help. I supposed all I could do was survive the 3 months. There wasn't another choice. So I made more traps and caught more rodents and made more bait and caught more fish and got more wood and made more fires and ate more meals. The cycle continued through the days and weeks. Finally, 3 months passed. I woke up that morning and found an old standard television and VCR. There was a VHS tape on top. The VHS had a piece of white tape on it with the words "Play Me" written in Sharpie. It had been 3 long months since I had seen or spoken to anyone, and the only communication I'd received was to survive this length of time. So all I'd done was trap, fish, eat, find firewood and burn it, all the while my mind was constantly wondering what the point of it all was. My days were basically what I'd wanted to do in the first place upon retirement, only not so roughing it. Finally, 3 months were up. The answer was here. And I was terrified. I put the tape in the VCR. It started up from the perspective of an old camcorder held shakily from the back seat of a car at night. I recognized the dash and mirror hanging air freshener immediately. It was my daughter Anne's car. I watched the camera as it recorded gloved hands covering a rag in starter fluid. Then the camera turned out the window and I saw Anne close up and lock her store for the night. Then Anne walked to her car. The one the camcorder was waiting in. I yelled at the screen but knew the moment was long past. And got in the car, not seeing whoever was in the back, and didn't even get the keys in the ignition before they sprung on her and gagged her with the rag. And fought and struggled. But the grip was too tight and she finally passed out. The camcorder cut to a new angle, staring out the windshield of a new car and showing country roads passing by. The car drove further into the woods, which became denser around it. We went through a gate, up a lengthy driveway, and there I saw the cottage. The one I was in. The camcorder cut again, and now we were moving down the path towards the back dock. The angle turned back and showed the handler of the camera dragging Anne, who was bound and unconscious, along behind them. The camera continued down the path towards the dock. As we got closer, I noticed there were things laid out on the dock. Namely, a rectangular length of fence was unspooled and flat along the wood panels. It looked like it was 6 feet tall by 9 feet long. Underneath the length of the fence were 2 sets of chains, each with its padlock on one end. Anne's body was dragged to the fence and laid out on it. The camcorder was put down, facing Anne's body from the side. A voice muttered over the camcorder, "Here are your fucking lock cutters." A large pair of bolt cutters dropped into the frame, landing on Anne's torso. Anne stirred. She was still alive. The fence was quickly grabbed and wrapped over Anne, swaddling her in layers of the metal mesh like tobacco in a cigarette. The chains under the fence were picked up and padlocked together, sealing Anne in completely. The length of the rolled fence was dragged to the end of the dock, where 2 cinder blocks and more chains were waiting. The blocks were chained to opposite ends of the rolled fence. The camcorder settled on the roll of the fence, and the voice came back again. I always loved the solitude of this side of the lake. One thing though, never had good fishing here. But I think the fish just never had anything to eat. And now, they do, and you do too. I punched the television screen as I saw the cinder blocks being kicked over the edge of the dock. I sprinted out of the cabin and down to the water and jumped in, swimming along the side of the dock. I swam down as far as the chain would allow, trying to see the bottom. But it was too deep and dark where she'd be. And there was nothing I could do for her anyway. She'd been eaten by the fish. And they'd been eaten by me. I threw up on shore and couldn't think straight for 2 days. I didn't know if I wanted to live, but I knew I didn't want to die like this. So I gathered all the loose kindling and wood in the area. I filled the cabin with it all and started a bonfire in the center. Then walked out to the water and lay in it, watching the cabin go up in flames. The fire spread to the surrounding trees. In little time, it took out several acres, attracting wildlife and emergency services attention. They found me there, alive, floating 30 feet out in the water, beside a charring dock and still chained to a tree that was amongst the inferno. I was saved and treated for all kinds of injuries and infections in a nearby hospital. I told the police about Patrick, but he was beyond their authority. It turned out Patrick had committed suicide after he dropped off the VHS tape for me to watch in the cabin. Patrick didn't know I got out. He didn't know I escaped, and he'd made no plan to even attempt to deal with the possibility that I might. The only plan he'd made was for a horrible revenge. I worked at an amusement park in the 80s and saw some disturbing things. It wasn't all bad. The staff was great, the pay was decent, and there were all kinds of perks including free day passes. There were lots of reasons to keep the staff coming back. But there was a bigger reason why people left. I spent 2 summers there as a lifeguard and shouldn't have gone back after the first year. But I needed money for college, and since the park itself was only in its 3rd year of operation, I'd have seniority over whoever came back. The place was called Thriller World, and to understand it, you need to know its history. The park was a large plot of land at the base of the Trembly Mountains. In the early 1920s, it was the location of a coal mine that dropped 1,000 feet straight down into the earth. It was a working and profitable mine for 30 years, but closed its shutters in the late 50s. The mine was owned by the Phelps family. Randall Phelps was one of the more industrious of the clan, and he stepped up to develop the land in the 60s to create a ski hill and resort. The mountain was long and treacherous and attracted enough customers over the years to invest in some minor improvements, but still, they were barely breaking even. So Randall came up with an idea to use the land in the summer months. And that idea was Thriller World. It was an amusement park that would include all manner of rides as well as physical aquatic adventures. There was an insane wave pool, tubing around an artificial river with rapids and heavy currents that circled the entire park in a quick-moving moat. There were slides that ran through tubes of varying lengths down the side of the mountain and opened up to a large pool at the center of the park. There was a Big Dipper, bumper cars, one of those pendulum rides, a fast-moving Ferris wheel, a human trebuchet and giant safety net, a teacup spinner, a carousel, a grand, haunted mansion. There were shooting and throwing games and prizes and food vendors. There was even a zip line over top of the entire park that would continually get stuck in the middle. And then there was the attraction that sparked Randall's imagination to create the whole thing. It was called Thrill Racer and was a race from the top of the mountain to the very bottom. You basically strapped yourself to an engineless lightweight bumper car, which had flimsy hand brakes you could use to try to slow down. Outside of that, the speed was entirely gravity-driven by the steep slope down the mountainside. The path of Thrill Racer wasn't straight down, but zigzagged around corners marked by large rocks with arrows painted on them. The ride down took just under 3 minutes on average, but some of the workers would stay after hours and try to set records. This is where I first experienced death at Thriller World. It was my first summer and my second full week working there as a lifeguard. I'd saved 2 kids from near drownings in the wave pool and was feeling shell-shocked. Davis, one of the older lifeguards who'd coached me since I'd started, told me all kinds of stories about the previous summer and the injuries and deaths that he'd witnessed in the park's first year of operating. I think the stories were meant to be comforting. What Davis said it came down to was this place wasn't a picnic. It was dangerous, and people who weren't ready for that attracted problems to themselves. The accidents were almost always the customer ignoring the rules. There was the occasional freak accident, and then very rarely a ride malfunction. But he reiterated Thriller World wasn't the county fair. It was a place you had to keep your eyes and ears open. And there was a reason why, amongst its staff, Thriller World had adopted a nickname drenched in blood, Killer World. Somehow it made me feel better knowing that others were aware of what was going on but weren't worried. And Davis had that young and invincible teenage edge to him that was infectious to anyone who didn't. Like me. I found myself drunk with some of the girls who worked the game tents. We watched as several of the operations and maintenance staff of the park were set to race 4 of the lifeguards down the mountain on the go-karts. Davis was one of the lifeguards. The maintenance guys brought a box of flares, and each of the carts was fitted with one along the back bumper. One of the lifeguards, Kara, went up to the top of the hill with a scarf to be the countdown girl. When Kara said ready, everyone readied their flares. When she said set, everyone lit their flares. Kara yelled go loud enough for it to echo down the mountain to us at the bottom. We watched as the racers took off, their red flares spraying out and illuminating them as the go-karts took corners and ripped down the straightaways. It was exhilarating being in the group as we all cheered for the different drivers and teams. Several of the carts were pulling away, with one far ahead of the rest. The leader was hitting corners hard and didn't seem to be using the brakes at all. Then it lost control. The go-kart hit a corner too sharp and it flipped, sending the driver colliding headfirst off a large boulder and into a violent tumble down the side of the mountain. Screams pierced out as the go-kart, lit by the red flare, launched into the air before crashing down and spinning and tumbling all the way to the bottom of the mountain. The body was still halfway up. Everyone who was watching ran up the side of the mountain. By the time we got there, the maintenance staff and the lifeguards who'd been racing were circled around the body. It was Davis, though it didn't really look like a person. It looked like a plush toy with all the stuffing taken out. Davis's girlfriend Molly, another lifeguard who'd been cheering beside me, rushed over and dropped beside his body. She tried to pick him up and hold him, but found Davis's body was like picking up wet laundry. The bones and muscles were pulverized. Molly tried to touch Davis's face, but even that was like a large Ziploc bag overflowing with lasagna. The investigation revealed that Davis had been going too fast and lost control. The go-kart he'd used was destroyed in its fall, so it was difficult to tell if the brakes had been working. But there were no marks on the pavement. Either way, it was pushed aside, and by Tuesday, everything at the park was back to normal. Except Molly never came back. I didn't blame her. I developed a drinking problem that summer, but managed to get it under control by the time I left for school. I told myself I wouldn't work at Thriller World the following summer, but when the time came to look for a job, there was little else in town that was hiring. I went back for my second summer, trying to convince myself it wasn't as bad as I remembered. The Thrill Racer was back in operation, as were all the other dangerous rides. But this year, there was a new one. At Thriller World, management always offered money to any of its employees who would test the new rides themselves, both for entertainment and safety. But in their newest ride, no employee would test it. It was called the Mine Drop. Over the winter, Randall had brought in engineers to work on the mine, reinforce its structure, and update and adapt its elevator to one that moves at an unnerving speed up and down. The elevator would take 10 people at a time and drop them 1,000 feet down into the pitch black. Since there'd been a cave-in at the bottom of the mine in the 1950s, which resulted in its closure, there wasn't anywhere to go down there. So the elevator would slowly bring them back up. There was talk of adding stops along the way up, where riders could get off and explore certain, closed-in areas of the mine. Perhaps even adapt the Haunted Mansion into the tunnel systems. But it never got to that point. In fact, it never even opened to the public. Randall paid 10 people from a local shelter to come to test out the Mine Drop after we'd all refused. The elevator reached the bottom and was halfway back up when all 3 safety mechanisms malfunctioned and the elevator dropped to the bottom. All 10 people were killed on impact. Their bodies were found in a pile of pulverized bone and meat. Randall did an exemplary job of keeping the details from the public, as he did with all the accidents that occurred. But the events of the rest of the summer couldn't be kept quiet. It seemed like every week, the injuries got worse and another body was added to the pile. In the wave pool, there were drownings from children being pulled into the suction generators. When the bodies were found, it was discovered they hadn't drowned. Their bodies had somehow been pulverized by the jets. Their bones and muscles liquefied. In the artificial river rapids that circled the park, there were a variety of strange deaths, including drownings and electrocutions from the underwater fans and the ungrounded electricity that circulated through the park. The lifeless bodies would be carried by the ongoing current around the park's moat until they were pulled out by special lifeguards referred to as pickers. One afternoon, I arrived for a shift, and as I passed the entrance, I saw the bodies of 2 boys, one after the other, face down, floating by like logs taken downstream in a heavy current. Apparently, they were on their second lap around the park and none of the pickers had seen them. Their bodies, too, were pulverized. But those were explained away as the bodies being tossed and bounced off the walls and fake rocks in the artificial river. I remember pulling one kid out of the water who'd just been on the edge of drowning. His body was covered in bruises. I heard him talk about hands. Hands in the water. Hands squeezing him. Hands pulling him down. I never managed to find the kid after that to ask him more, but I heard he moved away. The final nail in the coffin of Thriller World came at the end of August, and it involved Thriller House, the park's haunted mansion. The mansion was built specifically for the park and was filled with hidden room stairwells and shifting walls. It was easy to get lost in it, and people did. A lot. In fact, it was the attraction that seemed to cause the most issues among the people who used it. There were several kids who went missing inside. Because of the scale of the mansion and the shifting walls, some weren't found for hours. When they were finally discovered, it was always in the House of Mirrors room in the basement. And the children were always babbling incoherently. Thriller House also had a secret way up to the attic that most customers didn't find. Some of the other employees would go up there to drink sometimes after shifts. I joined them after one bad Wednesday. I was uneasy the whole time. The room was huge and there were only 6 of us, but it felt like the area was filled with breathing bodies pressing in on you. No one else seemed to notice, but I couldn't shake it. Then the power cut out and we had a reason to call it a night. The mansion creaked like an old home, even though it only looked like one. When we left, the walls leading to the doors outshifted on us and led us down to the basement, where we got lost for a half hour in the pitch black of the terrifying cellar. There were all kinds of frightening statues and props dangling from the walls and ceiling. We thought we were going to spend all night down there, but I finally found the hidden door leading up to the first floor. We got out and all went our separate ways. It wasn't until the next day at work that we found out a younger lifeguard named Jill hadn't come home last night after her shift. She was one of the people who'd been drinking with us in the attic. We all thought back and realized she hadn't come out of the basement with us. None of us saw her again after we left the attic. We agreed to go and tell our supervisors what we knew, but we never got the chance. While we were meeting to discuss what happened, a father had gone into Thriller House with his family and discovered the way up to the attic. In the attic, several of the floorboards broke and the family of 4 fell through. They landed on a group of 5 people below them on the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor then collapsed onto 8 people on the 1st floor, which then collapsed into the basement. And 3 more people who just discovered Jill's body. In all, 2 were dead and 17 were trapped in the basement under the rubble. The survivors were near paralyzed, all with the same injuries involving pulverized bones and muscles. As paramedics and firemen filled the mansion and lowered into the basement to start the rescue mission, an aggressive electrical fire started and caused the near-immediate collapse of all the weakened floors. 8 members of emergency services were crushed under the rubble and unable to escape the basement inferno as it burned out of control. I left after that shift and the park never reopened. If Thriller House wasn't enough, dozens of other lawsuits had piled up over the summer and a federal investigation was underway. The Phelps family sold the property to pay off the lawsuits, and as far as I can tell, there were never any criminal charges or jail time for anyone. A few families of the victims got settlements, but that was about it. Most people think what happened at Thriller World was negligence, cutting corners, and saving costs. But in the years that followed, I did my own research into the mountain and uncovered some history that disturbed me. The ski resort in the winter had similar, strange, and disturbing injuries and deaths as Thriller World. There were electrocutions on the ski lifts, killing multiple riders as well as operators. There were other electrocutions, most of them in the hot tubs in the personal chalets. 5 skiers were decapitated by an overhead metal wire that had fallen across the route down the mountain. There were horrific downhill crashes resulting in disfigurement and, in many cases, dismemberment. Somehow, all the bodies had the same specific trait in common: they were pulverized. So I researched further and started finding difficult answers. When the mine was shut down in the 1950s, it was because of a miners' strike. The strike was being led by 12 men who'd constantly been at odds with the Phelps family over pushing union affiliation. Details were hazy, but a late-night meeting was to be held in the mines among the miners and the Phelps. But there was a cave-in. All 12 of the miners' representatives were killed. None of the Phelps family had gone down to meet them. The miners' bodies were eventually found, but an investigation was stalled and then closed due to the Phelps family's ties to local and state governments. The bodies of the miners were said to all be the same: pulverized. The muscle and bones liquefied by the collapsed tunnel they'd been told to go to.